Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
You know, in the how-to or process analysis, you have to teach people, you have to show them what things are when they're completed, so they know how the steps you're showing them, the process of getting it done. There are two aspects of it. One is pure giving direction and instruction, and the other is imparting the knowledge behind the process.
Process analysis is explaining how to do something. All our lives, from learning to tie our shoes to teaching our children how to do the same, we must learn to explain and analyze a process. As we grow older, we communicate how to do things with writing. Unfortunately, the directions are not always clear. This program will show the skills of good process analysis writing, whether they're explaining how to outsmart a 300-pound football player, describing how to replicate a scientific experiment, or showing how to put a table together.
An Eskimo arrives in New York from Alaska. You meet him on 14th Street. He wants to go to Bloomingdale's. Tell him how to get there. Well, you tell him go to the subway. Oh, really? What's a subway? He doesn't know what it's. Oh, you know, a train. Where? Where is it? Well, it's a subway. It's a subway. I said, well, you have to go underground. And what do you do then? Well, you get a token. What's a token? Where do you get what is this token? How do you do it? You have to give them credit for ignorance. It's all right for you, damn New York. You know how to go in and buy the token, put it in. What do you do then? Then you go down the stairs. What's down the stairs? You go down because that's where the train is. Oh, the train. Now, how is the train there? No, it usually isn't there. You have to wait for it. And what happens then? The door opens, and what do you do then? You get on the train. Doesn't everybody know this? The kids will say. I said, no, they don't know this. If I drop you into the middle of the forest in Nigeria, would you know what plants to avoid? What poisonous plants to avoid? No, you wouldn't. Would you know that a snake, that's a snake? Is that a snake or is it a twig? You wouldn't know. You'd step in it. So you have to assume the same thing with people when you're given directions.
If I was going to be teaching how-to writing to a group of college students, I think something that I might want to consider doing would be to have each one of them bring in an operator's manual for some complicated piece of equipment that they love, and then sit down and rewrite one chapter so that it made sense. Because that's where you can really see bad how-to writing. My favorite one of all, I can remember my first motorcycle was a Honda C110 step-through. You remember the little ones, the red ones with the little white thing coming down, like the Beach Boys sang about? And in those days, the owner's manuals were translated directly from the Japanese. And they were obviously translated by someone with a dictionary, not someone who was bilingual. And my favorite passage in it was this illustration of this guy going, the bike falling out of control, and the caption under it said, "Beware the oil slick, for therein lies the dreaded skid demon."
I'll sit here with a paintbrush a lot of times, and I will, if someone is saying you've got to hold your fan brush like this as you do it, and they're telling me you've got to have your pinky behind it and your index finger here or whatever. If they're giving me this contorted thing and I'm trying to figure it out, if I can't do that, then it's not going to get across to the reader, and then the how-to is not going to work.
I learned that when I was doing some programming, simple programming for a robot. And it was interesting how steps were left out. Because you had to tell the robot, go 6 inches right, then 6 inches left, because we set up an obstacle course. And many of the students thought that, to get the robot from, let us say, here over to the 7,000, you just said, go. But you had to put in the actual language, 2 feet left, 3 feet right, 6 feet this way, to actually get the robot outside the door. And just that sort of logical, this happens, and this happens, and this happens. You have to be able to do that in a paragraph. You have to be able to do that in an essay. You have to be able to do that in a research paper.
I think one of the things I look for in a process analysis is for the student to be able to differentiate between what is absolutely necessary and what are just the frills. So in some ways between main points and subsidiary points. And once they've figured out which steps are absolutely essential, then they have to do some ordering. So we do organization. And we put organization and learning what's important together. We put description in with that, because sometimes if you're fixing something, you really need to know how to do that. And I think those are the basics of a good process paper.
Good process analysis writing often combines several of the thinking and writing strategies known as the rhetorical modes. Description, comparison, and narration are especially important.
Clear description is a very difficult thing to do, I think. It's one thing just to wade through a description. It's another thing to say it succinctly so it's logical, so that the reader can follow it step by step by step, so that he is actually creating in his own mind a picture of what it is you're describing. Because if he doesn't have a picture in his mind, he's lost. He doesn't have a map. He doesn't know where the road goes. He doesn't know where his destination is.
What makes a good description on the front end with people is just basic clean writing. You need to use the active voice. You need to not have very many adjectives or adverbs. Just cut to the chase is frequently what I'll tell a new person. Don't give me all the frills and details. Just give me the basic story. And then if need be, if they've cut it down too basic, then we can put some of the fun, some of the fluff, some of the entertainment back in.
You're using description in process analysis as well. Narration, description, cause and effect, definition, illustration, as a matter of fact, can be used in process analysis.
Definition is important because if you don't have a specific definition or an explicit definition, you'll wind up doing something that the person doesn't want you to do. For instance, like I just wrote a program where what happens is it opens up a file and then it displays information, for instance. And in my user documentation, I took the liberty of saying, I'm assuming that the file is going to be at this place in the computer. And if it's not in that place, then the program won't work. So that's user documentation. So what I've actually learned in English about process analysis, about seeing something for what it is and analyzing it and processing it and getting just the important information out of it, is going to really help me in my computer science.
You want to make sure that you spend more time talking about the process and making sure that you've drawn out the steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then you want to spend telling your own story, which is where a lot of things go wrong. A lot of times pieces go wrong because they've spent far too much time talking about their own experience rather than explaining to the reader what is going on here.
Again, in terms of my beginning people, I tell them get the how-to first, and then we'll add in the prettiness. Then we'll add in some of the storytellings. We'll pick out some of the things that are most interesting in the piece that readers would like to hear about or whatever.
If you're building a deck, I don't really care about the personal experience. I want to know, how do I put this board down so it doesn't warp, or what have you. That's the important thing. And it depends on the market you're writing for and all of that. But a good how-to, it's storytelling again, but a very specific, very concrete, very, very structured story. That is the story of how to build a deck. It's not Cecil B. DeMille time.
The writer who has learned storytelling techniques, including an awareness of coherence, unity, and the use of effective transitions, has more luck breaking down the individual parts of a process and explaining them in a logical step-by-step sequence, the essential skill needed for any how-to piece or process analysis essay.
To write a thorough descriptive how-to article is really writing a number of articles within the article, because each step is a little story in and of itself. So you have to set up each step so that, as I said earlier, you tell the reader where he's going. For example, you've built a cabinet, and the cabinet has drawers. Well, building the drawers may be one step of the descriptive process of building the cabinet. If you don't say, now we're going to build drawers, but simply say, now cut 2 pieces of wood this size and 2 pieces of wood that size and another piece of wood that size, and then do this joint and that joint and that joint, and then put the bottom together, and then at the end you say, guess what, you just built a drawer, he's going to have to go back and reread that part. It's really difficult. So if you set them up first and say, now we're going to build a drawer, and a drawer has 2 sides, a front and a back and a bottom, then you say, okay, now let's cut the fronts, let's cut the backs, let's cut the sides, let's cut the bottom. And all of a sudden it makes perfect sense. He knows where you're going.
I think it involves a great deal of critical thinking to put paragraphs together so that, in fact, one idea flows into the next logically and that the reader can follow. This is especially important in process analysis. The reader has to know step 3 completely and clearly before she goes to step 4.
What makes a good how-to article and what makes a good process essay is basically that there's got to be a linear progression through the article. You've got to have a step, whether it's written as step 1, step 2, step 3, or whether it just says first do this, then do this, then do this. There has to be a progression. You have to be able to follow whatever that progression is directly through it. It has to make sense. If you don't understand something, if something doesn't make a sense from A to B to C, then guess what? Our reader's not going to understand it either. So you have to understand this. You have to sit down and pick apart each part of the paragraph, each particular sentence in the paragraph. You break it all down, and it's all sort of a linear process in terms of how to, but it has to make sense. You have to be able to do whatever it is the artist is telling you to do.
Unity means that all the details that you have support that point. Coherence means that the thought flows through that essay, through that document, so that there is no logical break between one point and the next. Simple as that. And you can use that, and you can use a variety of devices to create transitions. Words, phrases, the repetition of ideas, the repetition of vocabulary, the use of relative pronouns, conjunctions, conjunctive adverbs, transitional words, transitional phrases, transitional sentences.
Research, including an in-depth understanding of the process you're trying to explain, is the basis of any effective how-to writing. If you don't know the background of the process you're explaining, it's likely your readers will end up just as confused as you are.
The more vague you are, the more general you are, the more you try to get away with not researching and not bringing that detail to your work, people know right away you're faking it. They don't want to read it. They don't believe it. But bring enough detail to your work, suddenly it comes alive. Suddenly people want to turn the page.
I had to do a lot of other research. I called people who worked in the industry, in particular Megadeth's management. I called and asked them for specific numbers and transactions and royalty figures and things like that. I also referenced Donald Passman's book. You know, it was good for me because I realized that even though I have a lot of experience in the music business, I realized I was still really ignorant about a lot of areas. And it forced me to put my ego aside and to reach out and say, hey, you know, I know this, but how can I relay this information and do it eloquently and do it in a way that can be simply understood? How can I relay this information to the audience? And sometimes that requires me going back and doing more research so I know even more about it so that it comes out easily and it's not something that's so cerebral.
Awareness of the target audience is essential for effective process analysis or how-to writing. A high level of jargon or technical language will work if the writing is aimed at members of a professional discourse community familiar with the words of the trade. A more casual conversational approach, using a layman's vocabulary, is appropriate for an essay aimed at first-timers.
What makes a good process analysis paper? Respect for the audience. The first thing you have to realize is that your audience will probably know much less about your subject than you do. After all, you're explaining it, you're the expert. So that you need to define terms, you may have to eliminate jargon, you may have to provide more detail than you would otherwise have done. So again, it's respect for the reader.
Whatever you call it, this business of being able to set down what happened when in some kind of sequence is very important in a number of disciplines and in a number of kind of writing. Certainly in some kind of a lab report or in an engineering course, in a lot of the science courses where you're trying to report on a sequence of events either that you conducted or that you observed occurring over time, then it becomes critical to be able to lay down events in writing in some kind of sequential and sensible order. But if you think about it, the same holds true for the historian or for a number of other disciplines where sequence, where events unfolding in real time become critical. And so then the writer's task is to think of how to do that in a way that makes sense, is logical, but is also compelling, also is able to take a reader through the process as it happened, and in fact maybe even giving the reader a sense of what it looked like to see it unfold, what it felt like to observe this process play itself out.
A process plays itself out on any autumn Sunday when football teams across the nation meet for a couple of hours on the gridiron. Coach Bill Walsh, formerly of Stanford University and the San Francisco 49ers, explains how it's all documented in a process analysis style that's important in the writing of playbooks, rule books, and scouting reports.
The learning process is so particularly important in athletics, in sports, because you prepare for the upcoming game and then you reap the rewards of your efforts and then prepare for the next game. And so communication is vital. Communication in all forms. It can be written, it can be verbal. Well, certainly we write techniques, and those techniques are left often to the individual coach. We need very distinct, specific written statements or the use of words that can be visualized into the process of playing the game.
Former player and coach Keena Turner explains how a linebacker might learn the subtleties of an otherwise purely physical act through reading the process analysis writing in rule books and playbooks.
There's techniques that have to be learned, and all these things you have to read and visualize and then be able to go out and perform. Unfortunately, offensive linemen can use their hands to a certain degree. They can't physically hold you. To a certain degree, an offensive lineman can use his hand, but there's much more freedom with the defensive lineman in terms of using his hands. He can grab the offensive lineman as he gets into his technique to move him out of the way. As a rule, you can use your hands. You can't hold receivers. If Jerry Rice were trying to run an out pattern on a defensive back, the defensive back couldn't go up and grab Jerry and hold him from running out. But he could go up and push Jerry to knock him off his course.
Much like the process analysis found in a football rule book, a scientist such as marine biologist Ku'ule Rogers would use this kind of writing to explain how to repeat a series of steps. The goal of much scientific research is to show how to analyze a process and replicate scientific procedures to confirm results and conclusions of an experiment.
We describe the experimental setup so that it can be replicated if necessary at some time. We describe each of the procedures and the methods that we use and the actual materials, the sizes, and other things like that.
See, we originally get the larvae from the Natural Energy Lab on the Big Island when they're less than a week old, and we bring them here, and they're microscopic when they get here, and we grow them out in these tables. But the problem with putting them in the ocean, we've had 100% mortality in the ocean if we put them directly there. So what we do is we place them in the tables first so we can allow them to grow a little bigger and avoid predation. A lot of organisms feed on the larvae of this oyster, In the ocean, there are octopus, there are various types of fishes that eat these, and there are flatworms and snails and all kinds of invertebrates as well. So what we do is we place them in the table until they're big enough to survive on their own in the wild. But we don't have to feed them. See, there's a little brittle star. There's a lot of things that come through the water, but they can't get through the paint bags. These are paint bags that are used to strain paint. We just get them at the store, and they will keep out the predators until they're old enough.
The size distribution of the sample indicates that they are fished despite legal protection. The long growth processes and high ratio of shell diameter to thickness suggest that growth of Pinctada margaritifera in Kaneohe Bay is rapid. The prospects for commercial culture of black pearls in Kaneohe Bay are limited by environmental constraints and the heavy recreational use of the bay.
These are spat collectors, which we have put out to look at recruitment, to see how many oysters are coming in, and recruitment hasn't been very good for this area. We found on the surveys there are less than 800, and this is the richest area in the state, 800 individual adults. The larvae are not recruiting here. They could be going out to other areas, but what we're hoping is that we can restock the population here and help the conservation efforts, since collecting is illegal now, and hopefully they can make a bit of a comeback.
The main point of the methods and material is if scientists want to replicate your experiment, then they're able to do it precisely the way that you did it, and it'll eliminate a lot of experimental error. It is like a how-to manual.
The how-to manual, the methodology section of a scientific research report, and the process analysis essay all have similarities in writing style. In our final example, we'll review many of the techniques recommended in this program as a professor of engineering explains the process of how to make a metal casting for a machine part. The techniques he uses to describe this process are similar to the ones you'll need for writing how-to instructions in school or in the workplace.
Everyone who's been around for more than 20 minutes has made a casting. If you take water and put it into an ice tray and stick it in a freezer, you have made a casting out of water. The ice tray is the mold that produces the shape you're after. It's similar in metal casting, only obviously more complex. A pattern is produced, and sand is rammed around that pattern in a container called a flask. So you have a mold that causes the molten metal to take the shape. So now you have a mold sitting on the line. In our case, it's sand. It can be a variety of other materials. And into that cavity, molten metal is poured. A furnace is used. It's a device that applies heat to a crucible, which is a refractory vessel that the ingots, which are what the alloy is called in the cold state, placed in the crucible. It's heated up. It turns to a liquid. That liquid is then transferred and poured into the gating system, which is like a plumbing network that allows the metal to be delivered into the mold cavity. You then break it out of the mold. Typically then that casting is moved into a machining facility and the final detail is applied. The process does involve moving molten metals. The aluminum, it melts at around 1200 degrees. We typically pour it at around 1350 degrees. We know the potential for a serious accident exists here. So you use education to explain what the dangers are and how to avoid them. They dress correctly, they put leggings on, they wear gloves, and most importantly, they put a full face shield on with safety glasses underneath. So if there's any splashing accidentally happens, then they don't suffer the consequence. So the casting process is fairly simple. You have a container, and you pour molten material into it. It solidifies, you have a casting. The Egyptians did it 6,000 years ago, and we've refined it. You may be interested to know that metal casting is the 6th largest value-added manufacturing industry in the world. Nothing flies, floats, or rolls without castings either directly in the product or certainly in the history of the production of the product.
What makes a good how-to article is really simple, is if you start the piece not knowing how to do something or anything about something, and you finish the piece and you know about it. You know how to build a deck, how to press flowers, how to clean out a closet, how to manage your money, how to do anything. How-to writing is the most prevalent form of writing today, especially in magazines. It also goes by the name service journalism, which I think is a really neat name for it because it's writing that serves. And it is telling someone how to do something. It's not a lecture, it's simple instructions.
I think no matter what your field is, sometime or other during your life you're going to be writing how to process papers. They could be in a letter where you're telling a family member how to fix a certain dish. They could be, when you're trying to potty train your child and you're processing the different elements and how to put them together. I think how-tos are a very important part of life. And an example of this is if you look at what is on the bestseller lists, very often they are how-to books. They call them by different names, but that's what they are. How-to books are the most popular ones. People want to know how to do things.
What I've actually learned in English about process analysis, about seeing something for what it is and analyzing it and processing it and getting just the important information out of it, is going to really help me in my computer science.
I think it involves a great deal of critical thinking to put paragraphs together so that in fact one idea flows into the next logically and that the reader can follow. This is especially important in process analysis.
Once they've figured out which steps are absolutely essential, then they have to do some ordering. So we do organization. And we put organization and learning what's important together. We put description in with that.
But a good how-to, it's storytelling again, but a very specific, very concrete, very structured story. That is the story of how to build a deck. It's not Cecil B. DeMille time.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.
This is PBS.